I'd like to welcome to all participants for our keynote speak session. I'd like to welcome all the participants, and I'd like to welcome also Professor Gerhard Schiffer. Let me say a few words to introduce our keynote speaker. Professor Gerhard Schiffer is Professor Emeritus at the University of Bonn, where he leads a research group of food chain management. Professor Schiffer has many activities, and I'd like just to mention a few of the points that of his contributions. He organized the annual Scientific International Forum on System Dynamics and Innovation in Food Networks. This is known as the Eagles Forum. I had the pleasure to participate, and also many Brazilian scholars and students have been there. It has been organized by Professor Schiffer in a very productive and human way. Human interaction is very strong in that particular conference. He's also in the board of many journals, like the Journal of Chain and Network Science, which is a very important journal in chains and networks in general, but also focused in agriculture. So I could talk much more about Professor Schiffer, but I think that the key points that I mentioned are relevant. I already said he's Professor Emeritus at the University of Bonn. Let me just, before giving the floor to Professor Schiffer, mention that we're living in a time in where the borders between urban and rural are changing, if not fading totally. We had many scientists in Brazil, like Professor Milton Santos, who studied the issue of the cities, the relevance of the urban connections. But he stressed the role of number of personal connections long time ago. Now we live in a world of virtual connections. What are the implications for the agro-chain networks, public policies directed to rural areas, private strategies? Well, there are so many interesting points in the paper that Professor Gerhard Schiffer delivered to us. And I think it will be much better to listen to his points. So let's welcome virtually Professor Gerhard Schiffer. He's going to speak in 30 minutes, about 30 minutes, and then we are going to have 30 minutes to chat. So please, to all participants, you can place your questions, Q&A in the chat, so we will be able to manage these points. So, Professor Gerhard Schiffer, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Decio. Now I try to put my presentation onto the screen and directly jump into it. Okay, I think you all can see it now.
Yeah.
You see in the top that we want to talk about agribusiness. And when you talk about agribusiness, you can look at the urban situation where we talk about virtual agriculture and many other issues. You can look at global chains, global networks, or you can look at the rural environment. And my presentation today is on the rural environment. And there are a lot of changes that might happen in rural economies, and we are interested maybe in looking into those areas. And then the question is, why is it of interest to look into the rural areas? Everybody's talking about urban agriculture, etc. Oh, yeah. The key issue is that we have a lot of changes at the moment. The relationship between rural areas and urban areas are changing. You all know that people, technology, services, they all move from rural to urban areas. But when we look a little bit back in history, we had a traditional relationship between cities and the rural area. You look at the graph to the right, there was always about 10%, 5 to 10% of urban population, and all the other people were living in rural areas. But now things change. We have a new imbalance. When you look at the graph, it goes up everywhere. Doesn't matter which country, which continent. So there's an imbalance, and the imbalance creates a lot of problems. In the urban area, we have a question of overpopulation. When you look at rural areas, with the problem of depopulation. And that creates more problems. In cities, okay, we move to mega cities. And maybe you have heard about also problem mega cities have to deal with. And on the other side, when we look at the rural area, the land gets empty. We lose services, we lose jobs, we lose opportunities. Now let's look a little bit back in history. How have the rural-urban relationships been discussed in the past? And we have to go back a long way. You look at the picture. It's sometimes in the 18th century. There was a person called Thünen, and he wrote a book about the isolated state. And his idea was, when you look at cities, they are somewhere in the centers, they are the market, and then around it you have certain circles of production, dairy farming, forest, then grains, field crops, and outside ranging and livestock. And that has been stable now for most of the centuries in the past. And now the last century, things change. The Thünen rings look completely different. And now we get to the point that we have to answer some questions. Can we reverse a trend, or should we reverse the trend? These are two completely different questions. Should we? Yeah, one of the problems is that the rural environments are not disappearing, but they are still there, and they are being left behind. People there are left behind. There are increasing disparities. Now there are different opportunities to deal with it. I like this one most. It's, you know, economists are really very critical type of people. There was a proposal by European economists in 2019. They say, okay, the easiest way is give people some money, pay them, and then move them to cities. So you pay the move, and then you leave the rural areas to themselves. It's much cheaper than developing rural areas. That's how economists discuss. But there is another alternative number two. You could eliminate or try to eliminate the classical disadvantages of rural areas. We have the low density of population. That's why we have no services. We are far away from urban centers, so we are not able to use urban services. On the other side, we have potential advantages. There are a lot of renewable resources. There's been a lot of discussion in the past. We have the food, and we have a natural environment which we might be able to exploit. And when you discuss this alternative, you can come up to the conclusion that you say there are opportunities as never before if we realize competitive advantages of rural areas. Yes, there has been discussions a long time ago, 2007. There's an organization called OECD, the Organization for Economic Development, and they had a conference in Madrid about rural regions. They had very good ideas. They said the key issue for developing rural areas is innovation. So what you have to do is to improve the capacity of rural areas to innovate. And they came up with 4 issues they think are crucial to support the capacity. You have to invest in education so that people can develop. You have to provide financial support so that rural enterprises can develop. You should establish or invest in ICT to bridge the digital divide. And you have to engage in networking to really support cooperative approaches and institutional innovation. From my point of view, I would also add that you should increase logistic capacities. Okay, there was another conference of the same organization 11 years later, 2018. Still, I call it still good ideas. Now look at the ideas to the left. They say again, innovation will be critical. What is needed? Finance, ICT, educational opportunities, networking. And now you look at the right, you find the same words they were putting down in 2007. So I take two conclusions from this. A bad conclusion, we have lost 11 years because the same issues are on the table. The good news is that there is a clear view on how to support innovation capacity. These are those four issues. But as you can imagine, because not so much has been developing, there came other players in. Up to the left, you have a sign of the European Network for Rural Development. It's a group of enterprises. It's a European consortium of companies engaged in rural and food activities. And they said, okay, let's move from the business side. Policy apparently hasn't been doing too much, so maybe we can engage. And they came up with three issues. They said, okay, we have to provide rural services, and it's possible because we have now digital and social innovation opportunities. We should invest in new rural businesses, new entrepreneurs, new markets. We have to think about it, innovation, and we have to engage as business in overcoming the digital divide. And I think that's the last and a very important point, we have to reorganize supply chains and networks to keep more of the value in rural areas. Now we try to link those two views, the business view and the policy view. So those two things have to be put together. And I now want to look at the business side, which is more of interest to me at the moment, and look at three major examples of business activities that we discussed to implement those elements to the left, the entrepreneurial initiatives. Three directions of business activity. The first one, eliminate deficiencies. And one of the issues was overcoming the digital divide. The second one, that we utilize new of the opportunities. We've been discussing this, new entrepreneurs, new markets. And the third one, that we exploit certain strengths. Also new entrepreneurs, new markets that could be developed. Now let's look at the first part. Utilize information and logistics technology to improve, to overcome space. Can reduce the relevance of space. And you see now, as we communicate with each other, we can communicate even across continents. It facilitates the exchange of knowledge, and especially it is able to deliver services. Now let's look at some of the examples. I am always impressed of this list. Unlimited evolving opportunities. We talk about education, trading, logistics, online communication, advisory services, online working. At the moment in my country, half of the population is working in home offices. We talk about online health, etc., etc., etc. All those elements that overcome the problem of space. Let's very quick look into the first one. I think you all know, we don't have to talk much about it. These are all just an example of courses that are being offered, very advanced courses on a global scale. So it doesn't matter where you are, you can learn and you can be educated. Online trading, logistics concepts, you know it, that's a key issue. We know all those things. But let's take an example here. That's just an example of farmers that connect up with consumers. And I like this example because they connect with consumers before they start their agricultural production. And then they grow what they think those consumers want, and then later on they sell it. Everything being done online. Also, when you look at logistics, I have taken just an example of our well-known Amazon. Where do they move? Into the rural area, if the infrastructure is there. You see that there are two motorways, okay, and that's where they are, but they are in a rural area. They generate jobs, and this allows services to be developed. Now we'll go to the next part, and that's a part I like extremely well, the use of renewable resources. I think we are rebuilding our food sector at the moment. And when I look at a table like this, I usually talk about soft industrialization because it's not dirty. We have different types of crops we grow in agriculture. I just name a few. Miscanthus is one of those grasses that came initially from China, sunflower, wheat, bamboo, etc. Also residues, waste. Many of those products or product wastes are being used for producing certain products that are mentioned here in the middle. Bioethanol, I think you know in Brazil almost more than we do, but also in buildings, in insulation, in pens, in paper, drugs, medicine, etc. And then you have the focus on different sectors where those agricultural production is moving into. Our traditional thinking is agricultural moves into food. All of a sudden, agriculture moves into pharmaceuticals, into building, into chemicals, in whatever. So a complete new focus of our future view on rural areas and agricultural production. And what I like most is that logistics favors rural areas because the bulk product is in rural area. From a logistics point of view, it does never make sense to transport the bulk product to some remote urban area for processing. It's much cheaper to do the processing in the rural areas and then transport the final product, which is usually smaller in size. And just a few examples to make you a little bit aware how people are researching at the moment. This is now an example for insulation material. On the top, you have our classical insulation material, styropor. And then in the lower part, you have different products, miscanthus, celanthus, silphium. And then you see the structure of those stems, the plants. And you see, when you look at the lower part, it looks like the chemical on top. And that's where people are developing. And I can take one example. We have a company which is producing some insulation material, which is 2 centimeters in thickness, and it replaces 20 centimeters of styropor. So tremendous opportunities. Also building material, okay, from different types of plants. And then I think you also have heard paper from grass, paper from tomato leaves. So you have tomatoes, you sell the tomatoes, and the packaging is from tomatoes as well. So development that is going on there in different countries. Now the last part, when you look at exploitation of strength, I think that's the very obvious one, and I don't have to speak too much about this part because it talks about tourism, it talks about the protection of the environment, and it is now, depending on the country in Europe, it's now becoming a big, big business. You look at the top, hiking trails, electronic bike opportunities, adventure. Maybe it's a little bit different your country, but still, I think it's one of the options that are in there to develop. So now we discussed 3 opportunities to develop rural areas, and all 3 are tremendously promising. So I take now the conclusion and the future is or can be rural. And I would call it an opportunity for a clean industrialization. Speaking about processing back into the rural area. Now the question is how to start. And now I would discuss a little bit how to start from the business side. That means integrating new business activities into new types of value chains. When we talk about farms, industry, and markets, and most of it trying to keep in the rural area. And that's now the big problem. You see here my red words, because we don't have existing chain models. This short change, yeah, we keep which fit the new products, completely new products that haven't been on the market and that need to develop appropriately to reach the market, who have little experience or no experience in processing them, in marketing them. There are new markets that need to develop, not an established market, and we have to develop new technologies along the chain. And that is now very difficult, and I think that's something not many people understand. It's difficult for established business organizations because they have their efficient process organizations. But what we need here is not efficient established process organizations, but we need something new. And that's a time for new business stakeholders. And that's a time for startups. And you might realize when you discuss about these new possibilities, new products, that in many, many cases, it's new young companies that are trying these out, not the big players, not the Nestles, not the Unilevers, but the small ones. They are ready for new and innovative ideas, but, and that's not a difficulty, they are short on finance. They are short on management capabilities. So what we need for a success in the future is that we try to match the business view, their initiatives, with an environment that fits them, an enabling environment. And that brings us to implications that are critical for both, for the policy and for the business community, and the business community. These were the two issues we were looking before, with the entrepreneurial initiatives, the opportunities that are there. And many, especially small companies, are thinking and moving there. And on the right side, where the infrastructure that would be needed to make things work. So both groups have to do something. We need a business engagement and we need a policy engagement. I just took this old remark here. Nothing saves a village like a good road to town and a good cell phone connection. It was for a long time ago, but it is still valid. And now it brings me back to the big question here. Will such joint initiatives be feasible on a larger scale? How can we answer this? Yes or no? I put the emphasis on larger scale. We've been doing a lot of analysis during the last 2-3 years on many, many cases, many countries, cases where new initiatives have been developed, where agriculture was working together with processing industry or processing groups, where new markets have been approached. And it's a tremendous disappointment. I've developed a database of such chains and networks. And the only successful, let's say the few successful ones were reports by government, where they said, we should do this. We should do this. A French development plan, a Swedish development, all talk about should, but real cases that are there are very few. And then it's only cases. It's not a large case development, a large scale development. Yeah, but if we say we want to establish it on a larger scale, then the question is how to do it. There have been proposals, there have been a lot of discussions also with consulting companies and others, and then they came up with this kind of common understanding that they say, okay, if we need to move, we have to move differently. We have to look into kind of integrated innovative ecosystems where business and policy, all groups have kind of integrated initiatives, develop them. We have to get away from projects. That's also, I think, a very interesting issue. Away from projects to programs. They are really more comprehensive, covering a larger area, larger issues. And the third one, I don't know if all of you will agree. We have to get away from science-driven to business-driven initiatives. That means from writing papers to getting things done, sorry. And the fourth one, we have to get away from separate agendas, like we have first the agenda of OECD, was a policy agenda. Then the other group, which was a business agenda, we had to move to joint agendas of actors. And I put there that I say it sounds easy, but it's really not. I've been engaged in a European project for rural development, and we've developed different tools. One of them, as I mentioned before, was a network tool for helping networks and for providing support for network development. And also tools that provides more business models for food, bio-based activities and other things. But this is just a little bit. It's not part of a program. It's not part of an integrated development, but it's just one small piece of something that need to be done. And for us, the question, and that brings me to my really final conclusion. Are we ready for concerted action? And the last one here, is there a role for science? And I'm a little bit critical, because science is divided in a diversity of disciplines, but we don't need different disciplines. We need the concerted action as has been proposed here in this proposal from the consulting companies. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was a little bit shorter than half an hour, but maybe then we have a little bit more time for discussion.
I think it's fine, Gerhard. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's go back to the normal mode here. Okay, so here you are. Let me, well, first, thank you very much. You raised many interesting points that will feed our discussion for the next 30 minutes or so. So let me say again, please, all the participants, you can place your questions in the chat. And let me go to the first question. I have some points, but I have some very good points already appearing in the chat. So Silvia Sais, our colleague from the University of São Paulo, with the pandemic, there was a tendency to relocate the origination of production, calling it reshoring, growth of investment in local production, as you mentioned, or else to increase the number of suppliers in various parts of the world. Thinking that this trend increases the cost but decreases risk, do you believe that the strategy of local production is possible for commodities?
Very interesting, because the policy or the situation we are in is a little bit supporting the development that I've been discussing. And I don't think it will increase costs, because with all our technologies that are coming up now, especially the digital technology, we have a lot of issues that facilitates developments. I have one example. When you look at the retail sector, at least in my country in the past, or also maybe all over Europe, the retail companies usually were sourcing all over the country and then aggregating everything in certain warehouses. And then from warehouses distributing again all over the country. Because that was the most efficient in the past, depending on the technology we had in mind, the communication possibilities that were. And it is now changing, because now it's much easier and for them to source locally. So we get completely different systems that are at the moment evolving. And with those thinking in mind, at least the European community is putting tremendous effort in trying to develop what they call short chains, because they say, independent of the pandemic, which has shown that we're in problems, but the global chains are no longer the chains of choice. It has to do not only with the climate, but it has also to do with the new technologies and the new possibilities we have. But it needs a new thinking, and that's a problem with established big companies and processes. They have efficient processes. It's almost difficult to change into something else which is also efficient, but which hasn't been proven yet. And that needs innovation. And that's when I came up and say, it's in principle the time of small companies who try. These are the innovators. Also smaller groups in retail, these are the innovators. And when you look at now at all those groups that, sell consumer products by home delivery, new issues are developing, which are difficult. They develop small warehouses in a very distributed way from where they distribute products to consumers. It's a tremendous, interesting time at the moment. And we will see many, many changes. It's fantastic.
Good points. Let me place one question and say again, please, to the participants, you can, even if you prefer to write in Portuguese, you can do that and we will translate together. So please feel free. Let me place one question, Gerard. You mentioned that we are moving to new network models in some way. And you also, in your paper, you talk about the new needs for cooperation. So cooperation is the key element in the old and in the new models. But when we cooperate in a larger scale, and this is already possible due to the lowering the costs of connecting the nodes in the networks, the point that I'd like to raise to you is that when you increase the complexity and the size of the networks on a global basis, we will also probably see the increase in the number of conflicts between the players. We still have the very old question of cooperation to generate value and some rules to share the value created. How do you think that which kind of global institutions will be needed to support the functioning of this global new generation of networks?
I see two questions in your question. One is cooperation as such, and which is not combined with complexity. For example, when farms get together to form a group that jointly sells their products to markets, that's a non-complex issue because it's more a kind of a horizontal network that together works and then moves to jointly service certain markets. And an interesting example, I sometimes don't dare to mention it, is Amazon, because Amazon brings together thousands of small traders and sells this under the name of Amazon. And when there are various cases also in Europe where farms get together and they have a brand name, and the brand name is the internet, the online connection. And people connect to the brand name and order, and then those different farms deliver. Either they have a service contract or they deliver, so they do it themselves. So these are simple, but this is new ways of using technology and reducing the complexity of the chain. They are taking out some of those intermediate steps. Another thing is when you cooperate on a in a vertical way. That's what was always one of my big issues in a discussion. Okay, because a lot of those things that need to be developed also when you talk about quality, when you talk about climate issues, has to be done in the early stages of the chain. But the gain is at the end of the chain. And now how to get this done? We have up till now failed. We have a few examples of one of our biggest retail chain, which has said, okay, we have a voluntary program where those farms and early processors, they contribute to a better type of production, less climate damaging or whatever. They get a higher reward from what we sell. So they say, okay, we can increase our return from sales, and the difference is put aside and giving to those who support. But this was now an internal chain organization issue. I don't know if an international organization can do it. I think it will be the market that have to develop. I've been discussing in the past very often, especially when it came to quality management, I said we need the government. I always said we need the government because people don't do it voluntarily. but I don't think that will work. It has to develop the push of the markets, and then the cooperation on different, how to say, parts of the chain. When you look at farms, farms are extremely powerful as a group. There is no power in them if they are individuals. And we have realized it several times. If farms get together as a group, they are tremendous powerful. They get their interest through. If they don't work together, they won't succeed. And I think these are the type of networks also that need to be developed in the future. And I think we're in a good way. Things are changing. And I think information technology exchange, easy communication between groups helps very much to develop such corporations. And then I think things will develop. So I don't know if that answers your question, Ethio.
No, what you're saying is that, well, the very same problems that we had with the old network models, we still have now, sure, because the power is there closer to the consumer. But now you raise another very important point. I'm just exploring a little bit more. Meanwhile, we wait for other questions. But you raise one point. The farmers are strong if they get together. And we have here in Brazil a very strong cooperative movement, which is well structured, and you see cooperatives in the whole country. What do you think that cooperatives must look? Because they are already good, important players, but usually they have not yet perceived, or they have not yet moved towards the direction of a new network model in which they connect better to the outside world, let me put, to the international environment. What is the message that we can give to the Brazilian, for instance, cooperative farmers cooperative movement?
We have some not so good examples from my own country. Some of the industry, processing industry, is in the hand of farmers. It's a whole dairy industry, some other industry. They belong to the farmers. And we had many, many protests of farms against their own processing companies. Because when you have an institution, if you build a cooperative which has a life in itself, it's a danger that it sees itself primarily and not so much the individual members. I think that's also one of the things that might change in the future, that the individual farmers, or there could also be small processors, it's the same on all levels, that they are not so much dependent on an institution they form, but on themselves, that the network itself becomes more important instead of the institutions the network has built. We are in a kind of a moving period, and we don't know yet how things will develop. But I think that's something common also when you look into the society as a whole. When you look at social media, we lose our, workers' associations lose power, but the individuals are gaining. That certain interest groups are gaining in power because they can easily communicate and can work on joint actions. So it depends on the cooperatives, how they develop. If cooperatives, at least in my country, do not adapt to the new time, they will lose in the long run. And when I say farmers develop their own groups and connect to consumers directly, that's a dangerous sign, because it means those in between are not doing their job appropriately. And that also relates to cooperatives that have their own activity, like dairies or other corporate activities or sales activities or whatever.
Good point. Good point. Well, let me just translate to you one participant, Maria Clarice Costa. She's from Rondônia, a state in the west part of the country, a very important agricultural region. She's saying that there is a cooperative that is going to use QR code to identify the production of farmer, of family business, family farmers, that they belong to the cooperative. So I think this shows some steps towards adopting more technology to connect farmers. Thank you.
Yeah, and the individual farmer gets more rights because it's his name and his farm that is behind the product. Yeah, so that's a first step in getting from this anonymous unit to the individual's bank. Yeah.
Good. There is a comment that made by Luis Flávio Maia Filho, one suggestion and one question. The suggestion: to make your case in a time of pandemics, mentioning One Health approaches could help. Now the question: institutional development matters. Markets do not operate in the vacuum. In some way, this question about the institutional aspect has to do with the point that I raised, which kind of global institutional arrangements will be needed in order to provide the support to the functioning of a new generation of networks. Maybe you'd like to comment.
You can set out as institutions boundaries, yeah, but you cannot really organize the rules. You have to, but I think that's everywhere. If you are not in a dictatorship, and if you have people with their own interests, their own saying, and if you want to be successful, people need to have a saying. You set up certain boundaries, and then inside the boundaries, those different groups have to find their way. We have now, at the moment, a hot discussion in my country when it comes to the pandemics, because it's a beautiful example. In the beginning, okay, we had very clear orders, orders by government. You have to do this and this and that. And then after a certain period, people said, forget about those orders. Yeah. And then people were doing whatever they wanted to do. And now government is trying to collect in everybody again and say, okay, we are setting some boundaries, and now please do what you think is best and what we also think is best, but you decide yourself. And then they think they can gain again the interest and engagement of people. So I think that's a big issue. And what I have always to say, technologies when they come to business and when they come to food chains and networks and horizontal vertical, technology, and especially communication technology, changes the game. And it allows individuals to bring in their engagement again and to do much more on a voluntary basis. The communication changes the world. And we haven't yet seen, we don't yet see how it develops, but there's a feeling it is moving in a direction which looks different, but better for the smaller ones.
Good points. Thank you, Gerard. Raquel Zanon, she's raising another point. She says, congratulations, how can we convince and engage public sector to act towards local change, considering the power of big companies and other powerful actors and interests in the opposite direction? So in some way, she's bringing the question of the conflicts in the chains and networks. Would you like to elaborate on it?
It's difficult. A lot has to do with markets. All our retail chains are now putting a lot of effort in marketing regional things, or products which you can link to a certain farm, products you can link to a certain production place, because they say that's the tendency by consumers. They don't want to have everything in these big packages, everything, but they want to have an individualized, link to where products or food comes from. And I think that helps these kind of developments. It is against, let's say, the power of the big players. And also when I come back to those new markets, when I talked about the rural development, which is not just about food, but about all those new elements that are developing. It's not the playground of the big companies. and many changes will happening. Many young people or young companies will emerge. So I think that we don't know yet. Maybe the big players will buy them, and say, okay, you are later on part of us. Yeah, but the innovation comes from there, and that limits the power, I think, of the big players. At least in Europe, Nestle and the Unilevers have to be very, very careful to not losing the market and to be play a role. And also when I said that more and more the sourcing of retail is local, and local sourcing doesn't mean Unilever. Local sourcing means local. So things are changing. It's not that it's the end of the big players. We need them because there are some areas where only the big companies can really, when you look at the big virtual farming and the issues like this, it's much too difficult for a small enterprise. But the sector will look different. Mm-hmm. Maybe the virtual agriculture is one of those examples. I watch this very closely. You have the big players like Philips, Toshiba, which build those big factories in cities. And then on the other side, you have the small startups which build, in my place, small production containers, which you put in retail shops. Yeah, so you have a separation of markets of different groups.
Let me raise another point brought by João Lamel. João Lamel is the president of the Association of Agronomists of the state of São Paulo. He's asking if the European governments are supporting the expansion and development of the modern rural economy, how much this is relevant for the European case, the governmental support. I'd like to add one point to that so you can maybe answer both together. My point is that looking to the issues that you are mentioning, that the relevant role that the private sector must play in this process, you are saying that infrastructure for digital, for logistics, for education is very important. Brazil now lacks the capital to invest, to do these investments in infrastructure. So probably in Brazil, differently from Europe, the support is not expected to come from the government unless we attract more foreign investment. So there are 2 points. João Amel is asking about the role of the government, and I'm adding another point, which has to do with the capacity to provide the investments that are needed to give the basis to the work of this new family of networks that are expected to come. Would you like to elaborate, please?
First mention to the second part, because that brings me to this kind of joint action. We call it the egg and hen paradox. Which was first, the egg or the hen? And if a government invests in infrastructure and businesses are not supported at the same time, you have an empty infrastructure. We had bad experience in some of the southern European countries, Spain, etc., where a lot of infrastructure had been developed, airports or whatever, but there was nothing around. It was empty, and it broke down later on. And when you want to get companies in there, it's usually the new ones, the ones who want to establish something, that are ready to go somewhere if they get the financial support. So you need management support, financial support, and get the business community excited to move there. And then you build the infrastructure at the same time. It's not easy. That's when I mentioned there, it's not something I have the solution for. But if you separate those two, it will not work, or it's at least extremely difficult to work. For the first part, the government support, I have to distinguish between government direct support on one side and what is being put into research. Europe has a huge research area. And it's almost impossible to have a project where you don't mention short chains, where you don't mention the rural component. They say, because they say whatever we do is not put more efforts into cities. It's not to increase urbanization. We have to make sure, and we have the possibilities, we have the technology, and we have everything in place to make sure that the rural and the local areas are being developed and move at a similar level as the urban area. So in the research area, it's very clear. There's no discussion. In the policy area, it's a little bit more difficult because, Europe is 2/3 funding agriculture farms, and not so much, let's say, that's not part of the foundation of the European community, that you establish markets or develop business environments. Yeah. So that's still happening. Yeah. But the Director General, which is responsible for business development, is one of the smallest ones in Europe. So most of the issues go so direct farming support, which is fine. Yeah, you can say that's okay. It's very okay, but it's failing. It's failing developing the opportunities that are developing now in this agriculture product development domain, where you have so many opportunities, but that's not in the supporting world. It's more keeping farms alive, making sure food is cheap, etc., which is okay for the short run, but I think they are missing opportunities in the long run. So the research part in Europe is a little bit disassociated from the policy part, and maybe it will merge more in the future. We are looking forward for the next 7-year program. Let's see.
Okay, we have another question from Sylvia Kaleman, our colleague from the University of Mato Grosso do Sul, already also a very important farming area in Brazil. She thanks to Professor Schiffer for all the important points you raised. Considering the major role of Brazilian agribusiness in feeding the world, how can we change the traditional conception of global chains to this more focused one that you're proposing? How could it be feasible under the need of food security? How can we manage to scale up these new initiatives? What is the role of institutions? Again, back to the institutional point. Thank you, Sylvia.
Yeah. So, should I solve Brazilian problems? Yeah, it's a key issue. When I look at continents, and Brazil is a continent and such, which has a huge of rural area, etc. Let's say from our agriculture and food perspective, we look very critical to Brazil, because we say, okay, they are more this kind of monoculture, looking so much on soybean issues, etc., and not developing really the opportunities that are in there. Brazil is serving the world with basic products. Here you say commodities. But when you really want to develop a country in terms of the agri-food world, that brings me back to this rural view. I think you have to invest much more in the stages following primary production, and then move more towards delivering final products to the world. I think that will happen all over the world. We have a discussion also in Europe to get away from importing those protein products and producing them ourselves. And I think it's the same somewhere else. So I think the tendency will be that companies keep more of the added value inside their own country and produce what they are best in terms of competitive advantages, and then develop the final products to the world market. That's what I think, but might be wrong. But I think there's a lot in it, and also public opinion. And public opinion gets stronger will push countries to move into this direction. I was doing a study a year ago, and then we had a discussion about GMOs. And then I went to Carrefour in France, Telco in England, Rewe in Germany, others in Europe, and everybody had on their main homepage, no GMOs. Yeah, and then said all of a sudden, you are in a conflict with countries like yours who are very much engaged in those parts. That means countries have to reflect what is their place in terms of production, in terms of processing, and what would they want to deliver to the world market. And much more will be happening inside countries. And we have been discussing a lot, had a lot of negative discussions about the last American president. But this thinking of doing most of things first in your country, try to find out what you can do best. And you have new technologies, you have new possibilities. We have even companies in my countries who are bringing back processing from other countries because they say, we use now robots. Now we can do it with the same value in our home country instead of doing somewhere else. And I think this way of new types of business development that will develop look more into having more of processing and product development in your own country. It's a speculation from my side, but wherever you look into the world, I think that is a tendency, and we have the possibilities to do it. And I think it's not worse. It's not that you say it's more expensive. No, the cost relationships are changing, and that's where we move.
Just one very brief comment, Gerard, because this is an issue that should take much more time. Brazil, in many products, we face the barrier of access to markets. Like, for instance, coffee. We can export the green coffee, but we cannot export to Europe the processed coffee. So it is an old and difficult issue to deal.
Power.
Yeah.
You know, I had one example once. The biggest retail chain was trying to get farmers to deliver data because they said we need it for quality management. What was the result? They never got anything because they got together and said no. And I think in many, also when you talk about coffee, what will happen if Europe wouldn't get any coffee anymore? You know, it's a question of staying together and utilizing the power you have.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We are about to end our, but we still maybe we have time for a very brief answer for a question placed by Luciana Florencio. She took part in many of the conferences in Innsbruck. She's asking, Professor Gerald, it's a pleasure to hear your insightful ideas and reflections. As you mentioned, you are seeing the power of social media over public opinion. How business and institutional agents can take advantage of social media to demonstrate the rural modern shift and opportunities to people living in big cities?
It's a big issue, yeah. And one of the problems is that you know the power of social media. We know that it's extremely powerful, but you also know that business is not yet ready to use it. We are in a very, very early stage, and at least in my country, almost, let's say, we are in an extremely primitive stage when it comes to using social media in terms of using and knowing how to use it for your own good. And it's exactly that. You can directly approach your target groups. And that is without passing through anybody who can control what you can communicate. And that's a powerful issue. We don't yet really know how to use it appropriately and what to make out of it.
It's a process. You are learning, yes. Well,
it's a fantastic time.
Yes, we are talking about a fantastic time. We are exactly 1 minute later after our deadline, but I think that First, let me thank you on behalf of all the participants, on behalf of the University of São Paulo, of the School of Economics, Business and Accounting. I'd like to thank you for joining us as a keynote speaker. I'm sure that this issue that you raised in your paper can feed a lot of discussions, much more discussions, and I hope to be able in the near future to resume the presential conferences that you organized so well with a fantastic spirit of collaboration. So, dear friend Gerhard Schifter, Professor Schifter, thank you very much for your participation. If you like to take some final words, please.
I thank you very much. And you have realized the power of new technologies by communicating with me in my small room. The picture is not my room, but in my small room, and communicate with all of you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.
Great. Thank you, Gerhard. Thank you for everybody that participate. Thank you for the organization. Also, you did a great job. And so let's please, to all the participants, the program is so beautiful. Keep placing your eyes on the next sessions. Gerhard, thank you very much. Let's keep in touch.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Thank you. Thank you all.